Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about Marc Maron's problem with Joe Rogan. It's really no secret that Marc dislikes Joe. He's been taking shots at him throughout the years on different podcasts, and then just recently on his new comedy special, he made fun of Joe a little bit. He didn't mention his name directly, but it is pretty clear who he's talking about. You know, he's mentioning how comedians are always complaining about things being too woke and cancel culture and how they can't say anything and they're scared of getting canceled, all that stuff. Then he also mentioned elk meat and vaccines, you know, all the usual stuff that people associate with Joe and make fun of him for. But in terms of reasons why Marc hates Joe, all that stuff just seems like it's the tip of the iceberg. And there are a lot of other reasons he's mentioned throughout the years. And these two actually have a pretty funny relationship. Joe says when he first started comedy, Marc was the first established comedian to actually give him some praise and some helpful advice early on in his career. And he said that helped out a lot. But then after that, it sounded like Marc just didn't really like Joe anymore. And for the next 20 years, they didn't really say much to each other until Joe went on Marc's podcast in 2011 and they talked about things.
It was weird that you tweeted something and you said we've known each other for years, but we've never had a conversation.
Never really have.
It's weird, right?
Yeah, it's really weird.
I mean, I've had a relationship with you in my mind. I remember when you started doing comedy, I think.
I remember very much when I started doing comedy.
Was it 88, 87?
88, August 27th.
Really? You know the date?
Yeah.
I remember you showed up at Stitches. Are you going to say something nice about me?
Yeah, I was going to say that I'd been doing comedy maybe 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
And you were already an established professional comedian, and you came up to me at the Comedy Connection, and you gave me some really nice advice and a compliment, and it fired me up, and I was really excited. Yeah.
Do you remember what I said?
I would have to be paraphrasing, but you know, you were saying something along the lines of you're doing really great stuff. Keep with it, stay original, keep writing, just keep doing it, and you know.
So if this story's true, it's pretty funny because it sounded like that compliment motivated Joe and helped him out a little. But then as Joe became more successful in comedy, Marc started hating him because he felt like Joe should stay in his lane.
You know, when I first saw you, I had this problem with guys who were, you know, athletically oriented or had some sort of athletic nature about them before they came into comedy. And I remember that you and Kevin Flynn, he was like a soccer guy.
Yeah.
And you were a kickboxing champion. And there was part of me that was like, this is not for them. This is not their world. Why are they here? Why don't they stay in their competitive world?
Oh, that's silly.
Well, of course it's silly. But you were sort of a cocky then, weren't you?
Well, I was definitely a lot different than I am now, but I was right. It was literally not even removed from fighting. I was still competing.
This is pretty much how most of the podcast goes, and it only gets worse from here. You know, it's like Marc bringing up a reason why he hates Joe, and then him trying to convince Joe and himself pretty much that that's a valid reason. And Joe does agree with him on some of the stuff, even though I think he might be saying this just to be nice. But he says with the fighting thing, he'd probably feel the same way about it if he was in Marc's position.
I don't know. You know, I mean, first of all, you know, like if you're not around someone like that and all of a sudden you're around some guy and you hear this guy's a martial arts champion and now he's doing comedy,
yeah,
I would probably feel the same thing. Like, this is guy invading our spot and ruining our vibe.
And then obviously what bugged Marc the most about Joe was the fact that Joe started becoming successful. You know, also Marc did an interview with Dane Cook around this time, and it seemed like the same deal with him. It's like, I don't respect these guys' comedy, so I don't think they should be successful. You know, Marc's the kind of person that probably thinks comedy needs to be done a certain way. And I'd imagine for him, stool humping is not the right way. And then for him to see a stool humper go on and become successful and get TV deals, that probably pisses him off.
And getting all these opportunities 6 years in.
That was just dumb luck.
I just have to admit to a little jealousy, but that doesn't surprise you, does it?
No, that's the dark element of comedy and anything artistic is seeing somebody else get something, and for some reason or other you feel like they're taking from you. It's just like why isn't that me, and why is that happening to them? It's like.
And Joe's even talked about how much he hates this kind of thing, but you know, I think he's trying to be nice to Marc. You know, he's mentioned on other podcasts that this is one of his pet peeves. He hates the fact that people will start getting jealous if they see somebody else becoming successful, and they'll act like they're not getting the respect they deserve.
And it's a very strange thing when guys get angry that for some reason or another they don't get the respect that they deserve. That is one of my pet peeves. That's a weird thing when people do that. But I don't think it's a very healthy attitude at all to look at someone else's success as if somehow or another it's bad for you. You know, and I think if someone's not paying attention to you, like there's a lot of dudes that are like, you know, I don't feel like my act gets the respect that it deserves. Like, it gets the exact respect it deserves. There's no other way around it. Yeah. It's the perfect connection between you and an audience. And if it's not getting a reaction, it's because of one of two things. Either you've been very and marketing yourself or promoting yourself, or you're not seeing it the way other people are seeing it. You haven't found your audience.
I don't think Joe's referring to anybody specifically right here. I don't think he's directly talking about Marc, but I think he was definitely aware that Marc was like this. So another reason why Marc hates Joe that he brings up while Joe's on his podcast is he feels like Joe is a sellout and doesn't really respect comedy because Joe did Fear Factor. And Marc basically spends the rest of the interview trying to get Joe to admit that he did something wrong by hosting the show.
That your television career, not news radio particularly, but Fear Factor was antithetical to who you are now, and that I thought it was hard for me to accept that you were able to stand in a position of judgment of what comedy is or isn't, having done Fear Factor and the impact it had on the comedy business and television.
That's an interesting angle, and I gotta think that angle's got to be coming from some weird animosity that you might have had to me already before this, because first of all, I mean, how many sitcom writers are really comics? It's very few.
Well, they all, how many people? A lot of them started as comics. I'm just saying in comedy in general. You can't
say that that's taking away jobs, because it's an economic issue, and if I wasn't hosting it, someone else would have hosted it.
Being the type of person you are and being on the path you were at, I know you were making millions of dollars, but there had to be something that was sticking in your craw. I mean, it had to hurt somewhere.
It didn't feel good. Yeah, no, I didn't enjoy it.
Because my question is that if Bill Hicks were alive, who was a hero of yours, how would he have said? What do you think he would have said about Fear Factor as a reality?
Oh, I'm sure he would have made fun of it, as I would if I wasn't on it. If I wasn't on it, I would have made fun of it for sure. But there's something that you can't really financial freedom, like real true financial freedom, is a really underappreciated thing.
Absolutely,
the ability
and there's
to never worry.
There's a price for it.
Yeah, but the price was a few years of work. And while I was doing that work, I was only working 3 days a week, and I was still able to do stand-up and do a bunch of other things. And I did stand-up while I was on Fear Factor. And it was kind of screwy, though, because a lot of the people would come expecting to see the guy from Fear Factor, expecting to see, squeaky clean.
That was the burden of your Faustian bargain.
Yeah, and I'm doing jokes about drugs in the Middle East and all this crazy shit and evolution, and, it was a weird transition, but in the end, it all sorted itself out.
Because that exactly what you're saying is that right? Yeah, I mean, obviously the financial freedom in a real sense, is certainly something that people strive for, and it is freedom in a capitalist system, and there's no doubt about that. I understand that, but that is also the very essence of the Faustian deal of selling out. That you get that. But, in the aftermath of that, you're going to have to wrestle with what you seem to have wrestled with, which is that, I know I did that, but I'm not that guy, and that guy, that did that was just doing that for money. Now I'm this guy.
I think Marc just wishes Joe had to deal with this kind of stuff. I think Marc was hoping that Joe would just be stuck as the Fear Factor guy for the rest of his career and not really do anything else and not be that respected in comedy, because he already couldn't stand Joe. And then to see him go on and get some goofy reality TV show that he's probably just doing for the money, he probably just lost it. And now the fact that it didn't really negatively affect Joe's career at all, Marc just sounds pretty bitter. Like, Joe even says that he does not regret doing the show because obviously it worked out well for him. And I guess it was kind of a sellout move, but I don't think many people had a problem with it. I think mostly probably other comedians had a problem with it, or fans of other comedians, because Joe handled it pretty well. I think where people go wrong with this kind of stuff, when somebody does a move in their career just for money and exposure, or they do something to start their career that they don't really believe in, I think they go wrong when they start resenting their audience. Like right after Joe got done doing the show, if he just started talking about how much he regrets it and how embarrassed he was of it, and he started trashing the audience and getting annoyed at people bringing up Fear Factor or something, like if Joe started talking like that on Marc's podcast, then I feel like it'd be a sellout move. And it seems like Marc wants him to talk like that. But Joe, he does admit he didn't enjoy working on the show most of the time, and he was mostly doing it for money. But at least he's not trashing his audience. He understands why people like it. I think I'm the same guy. I think you as long as you're saying while you're doing it that you're doing it for money and just keep pushing forward, there's certainly a price you pay as far as perception goes. Do you feel like you contributed to the dumbing down of the culture? No. Really? No
Why
doubt
not?
About it. It would have dumbed down without me. There's no stopping
But isn't that a cop-out in a way?
No. The show was hot dogs. Are hot dogs bad for you? Yeah, well, sort of. You shouldn't eat them every day, all day. But sometimes I want a steak, and sometimes I want a fucking hot dog. And sometimes I come home from a hard day at work. I want to watch some kids eat animal dicks on TV. Why is that bad? It is what it is.
You tell me, why is that
I
bad?
don't think it is. I don't think it is.
You
I think it's
okay?
a choice. I think it's a choice and a broad spectrum of choices, and you can choose to, watch the Discovery Channel on some new fucking show on Hypernovas, or you can choose to watch Fear Factor. It's up to you.
Right.
But what it is mindless entertainment.
Yeah,
And
but in general,
no different from that than a sitcom. That's mindless entertainment too. It's just fun.
Sometimes, but I mean, in sense that as somebody who is a critic of culture and somebody who is enlightened, what do you think of those people that choose to watch Fear Factor over and over again?
Well, I watched it too, and I also watched Survivor. Yeah, but I watched Survivor. I wasn't in that. I've watched a lot of dumb shows that I'm not in. I think you could definitely say that shows like that and anything that's broadcast in front of millions and millions of people is going to contribute to the way they think about things.
And I know a lot of people would say, there was a time where the idea of selling out, had more resonance. That now it seems that people are like, hey man, do what you got to do. If you can keep your personality, it's cool. Do whatever commercial you want as long as you rise above the commercial. But I guess my big question, and you seem to address it a bit, is that being somebody who is as passionately involved with the evolution of the human community. And the idea that, we are all operating on a series of wavelengths and share a lot of common possibilities for growth and really taking this thing to the next level. And that is where your comedy comes from. It's calling out morons and being proactive about what our biology enables us to do that you couldn't have carried, that it must have been a fairly weighty cross to bear.
It definitely was at many points in time. Yeah, especially the days where I thought it was really stupid. Like there was days where the stunts were really just dumb, and the people, especially the people. If the group was cool, like it was a crapshoot every week.
So I think after this podcast, most people felt like Marc was just coming off as like jealous and bitter. But then a few years later, Marc actually went on Joe's podcast. I think this was his only appearance on there, and people actually really enjoyed it. People thought it was a great podcast. They talked a lot about the comedy scene back in the late 80s and 90s, and it seemed like they really enjoyed talking to each other. And at the end, Joe said, we need to do this more often.
You were talking to me, fighting my insistence that my idea of who you were was really you. And you were literally like, I don't know what, you've made up something. But I'm glad we were able to do this and this finally happened.
I'm glad too. It was a lot of fun. Let's do it more often.
At any
We
time.
can sit down. You and I could talk for days like this. I'm sure.
Absolutely.
We have to stop now because we're running out of time. We're at the end of 3 hours.
But Marc definitely still has some resentment towards Joe, and I'm sure Joe's podcast becoming insanely successful has only made it worse. I believe Joe started his podcast right after Marc started his, so just like with comedy, Marc saw Joe's podcast take off right in front of his eyes, and he obviously thinks Joe's podcast is highly overrated. And he's taken some shots at it throughout the years, like I said. And one of the times he was on Tom Segura's podcast, and I actually thought this was pretty funny. He's making fun of Joe and all the comedians that latch onto him.
You weren't one of the guys that, rented out space in Joe's ass. And, you... Yeah. It's just like a human centipede in Austin. It's like Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, and 3 middle acts, So... But you seem to do your own thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we have our own, our own.
See, people are going to see that and go, look at Maron, he's bitter. It's like, why wouldn't I be? Why? $100 million for going, I don't know. Really?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Hey, Rogan's pushing back. I don't know, man. So, look, God bless.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to sit here and accept Austin as the next Shangri-La.
I'm sure that's another reason why Marc can't stand Joe. The fact that Joe's pretty much the gatekeeper for comedy now. This guy that Marc already had no respect for doing Fear Factor and stool humping and everything. And now he pretty much gets to dictate which comedians are funny and deserve to make it. So I also have another podcast here where Marc's talking to Patton Oswalt, and they both start making fun of Joe.
I don't think anybody looks at Joe Rogan and says, I want to emulate his comedy. I couldn't even identify what that would be.
I've always said about Joe, what's so ironic and kind of beautiful about him is Joe Rogan is doing what people like you and I were always saying people should do. Push the boundaries, experiment with drugs, question reality. The only thing that went wrong with him was someone gave him $200 million. That's where he went nuts. Like, if I had a podcast about knitting and someone gave me $200 million, I would yarn on my podcast.
Sure.
I would have gone nuts.
So it would be funny seeing Marc on Joe's podcast again, saying all this to his face. I wonder if Joe has asked him to do any podcasts since then, or maybe they have done one. I couldn't find any. But, it seems like maybe Marc just doesn't want to go on there anymore. That would be my best guess. He probably just doesn't want to be a part of that or something. He thinks just going on there is selling out now, which I don't really blame him for not going on there. And I do agree with some of the points he makes about Joe, but he just sounds way too bitter and jealous half the time. But let me know what you guys think about the whole situation down in the comments. And then make sure you check out my Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. There's a bunch of videos up on there. And then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.